I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off-road. The guy managed the group. He was like, what are you doing in this beautiful car? I'm like, I'm going off-road. He's like, are you sure? Because you can use one of ours. And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
Did you know that the average person who escaped the World Trade Center during 9/11 sat at their cubicle on average for a full 6 minutes after the building was hit? I think to myself, I would leave the building immediately. But when you're in the moment, your brain sort of goes a little crazy. And I know this because I actually was at or right outside the World Trade Center and I saw the first plane hit it. And your brain does, when it sees something so life-threatening, disastrous, and unusual, your brain does weird things. So what kind of person survives a disaster? What kind of person did leave the World Trade Center as opposed to stay there? The guest we have on now, Amanda Ripley, who wrote a book called The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. She was telling me that the average plane crash is actually immensely survivable, and she explains why. But what kind of people actually leave the plane when after it crashes, and what kind of people stay in the plane? What kind of people leave when there's a fire, and what kind of people sort of don't even recognize what's going on enough to leave? And I think this applies to more than just extreme disasters. This might apply to relationships. What kind of person leaves an abusive relationship and what kind of person stays there? And again, it's useful to know this information. It's not just about surviving disasters. It's about taking into account very real risks that happen every day in our lives or could happen, and being ready enough that you could survive a disaster. So Amanda Ripley's book was called The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why? And Amanda explains the rest. I'm so excited to be talking about this. Thanks for agreeing to come on again.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so the unthinkable, such an interesting topic. Who survives when disaster strikes and why? First off, Amanda, how come you wrote this book? Did you survive a disaster?
So to speak. I was covering a lot of disasters for Time magazine sort of by accident, and then it became like my beat. So I was, covering 9/11 and the anthrax attacks and hurricanes, and I started to find that people were telling me these incredible, surprising, interesting, sometimes hopeful things about having survived a disaster. And none of those things were making it into the normal stories or the kind of, policy debates about how to prepare for terrorist attacks or hurricanes. So, it was partly a way to kind of preserve my own sanity, but also a way to learn from people who had experienced really, really sudden life or death ordeals and had things they wanted the rest of us to know.
You found some common characteristics among people who survived, like, for instance, a 9/11 or a plane accident or, these other catastrophic situations, and you found things in common. But you said just a second ago, you needed to preserve your sanity. Why is that? Like, why were the stories so extreme that you were like a doctor returning from ER at the end of the day? Like, what was going on in your head when you were hearing all these stories?
Yeah, I mean, I find that typically in the news coverage of disasters, we do like one of three categories of stories. So there's the stories of suffering, right? Then there's the stories of blame and stories of fear. So predicting the next disaster. Those are important, all those three things. But after a while, it does kind of wear on you. And I found that to do justice to people's stories of loss and suffering and blame, you really had to feel it at some level. At least I did, And I could only do that for so many years before it felt like I just couldn't keep going through that. Yeah.
It's interesting because you mentioned one statistic in the book where people in California, for instance, are worried about earthquakes even more than floods. Even though there are more floods, they should be more worried about floods than earthquakes. And so maybe because earthquakes were in the media more and California is known for earthquakes, do you think when you were covering so many disasters that every time you walked in a building, you looked for all the exits just in case there was a terrorist attack, or every time you went on a plane, you made sure you were sitting near the escape hatch? Like, were you getting overly prepared for disasters?
My husband would say yes in some situations. Like, I was hypervigilant in certain situations. I would say that I was probably more attuned to low probability, high consequence events or high probability events, right? So, for example, I became much more worried about car accidents than I had been before because the probability is just so high comparatively, but also floods, to your point. Like, flooding is not something I thought about ever. And so there were things that I feel like I got smarter about, but it is also hard to turn that off. Like, I remember once coming back from, I think I was covering Hurricane Katrina and then Rita, and I came back. I was living in DC and my mother-in-law was visiting. So, I'll never live this down. But there was some extreme firework event at the Kennedy Center by some kind of Chinese fireworks performance group that sort of had never happened before. And so you suddenly heard late at night these unexpected, explosions that felt very close. And it was not July 4th. So I just got up very calmly, grabbed my stuff. I'm like, we're going. I don't know what this is. and I just had a kind of default for action for a while. And my mother-in-law, we woke her up and she was like, I'm not going anywhere.
That's funny.
And so I'll never live that one down. But
that kind of represents a lot of the things that were happening in the book. As some people go in denial, some people take action quickly. And it's interesting. I bet you if you do a word search for the word thud in your book, there's probably a lot of it. Like, every airplane, there was a sudden thud. And then after that, like, now if you hear a thud in an airplane, are you immediately looking for your parachute or?
Yeah, no, that's true. I'm actually doing that right now. I've got 4 hits so far so you're not wrong. That's a lot.
Yeah.
4 thuds in one book. The airplane I actually got much more comfortable on, which is interesting because one thing I learned that most people don't know is that most plane crashes are survivable. So even if in the very unlikely event that your plane goes down, it's important what you do. Because most plane crashes, they end up on the ground and on fire. And you have very little time before the smoke becomes, too toxic to survive. So the whole trick is getting off quickly. And there are certain like tricks that flight attendants have learned and others. So, that kind of, anytime you can give yourself a sense of agency, even if it's a touch delusional, that does reduce the dread, the amount of fear that you might have, because you want a little fear, but not too much. So yeah, plane crashes bothered me less.
I guess the average plane crash doesn't like explode in the air and everyone
Right.
dies. Like they must, like an engine is going out and they have to land on top of a forest, and so the plane's all smashed up. There's a fire happening, and what do you do if you're not sitting by the hatch?
Yeah, no, so the problem is what they found in the sort of 70s when they were having more plane crashes, way more than we have now, is that often the plane would end up on the ground and on fire, and people would just sit there and not move. And that's because we are often sort of hardwired, particularly in really unfamiliar life or death situations, to just kind of shut down or play dead, right? And it's not always a bad idea, but in that case, it's a very bad idea. And we haven't really evolved for that kind of experience. So, okay, well, what then? What they found is the firefighters would get on the plane, put out the fire, and they'd find people just, dead with their hands crossed on their laps. They haven't unbuckled their seatbelts. So that's very worrying. But, the cool thing about emergency responder type people is they're not like, they don't spend a huge amount of time just bemoaning humans. They actually try to come up with ways to deal with humans. And so one of the things that the people who study plane crashes learn is that if you give people aggressive commands in a kind of extreme, unfamiliar situation, they will be remarkably compliant. So,
Well, you mentioned in the World Trade Center, there was a guy, I forget his name, he worked at Morgan Stanley.
Rick
and,
Rescorla, yeah.
Yeah, and whenever he said something like when something happened, he said, "Okay, everybody get on the ground." Everybody did, and he's like, "Okay, we're gonna go to this other stairwell." Everybody did. Why do you think? What type of people become the leader, and what type of people become compliant, and what type of people remain forever in denial?
Sometimes it's the wrong people who become the leader, right? If they don't actually have knowledge and they lead you right into death's door, and often you don't know, right? Like, to be fair, in most really intense disasters, there's no true north. You don't know which way to go. But one thing that we know from the research is that it is very context specific. So if you have a job in a place, if you're working in a movie theater, say, and it catches on fire, you will tend to take more initiative and lead, as opposed to if you're an audience member or a plane passenger. When you're in a passive role before the disaster strikes, it tends to influence your behavior in the disaster, right? And then there are other people who seem to perform extremely well, even if they were in a passive role. And that often, it's hard to research, right? But anecdotally, what I found is that often were people who had been in another disaster in the past or had realistic simulation training, either with the military or some other profession. So they kind of knew that they had to push through the immediate phase of denial and take action, and had trained for that realistically. So it's easier, even if it's a different event.
So, like, if a retired pilot was a passenger on a plane, so he's not an active participant, he's probably more likely to be more active.
Yeah, and there's a sense of agency, right? Because you kind of know how a plane works, and you know what's supposed to happen and not supposed to happen, and so that's kind of that sweet spot of experience, familiarity, but also an awareness that something is truly wrong and that you should have a bias for action.
So maybe, like, tell some stories from some of the disasters, some of the stories in the book, for instance. Like, what's some disasters where the actions of people astonished you?
So many. One of the big surprises from the 9/11 evacuation was that people took twice as long to descend each staircase as the safety engineers had predicted for the World Trade Center. So people move very slowly in disasters. Part of that is that denial phase. Like, it takes a while. I think on average, it took people 6 minutes to decide to evacuate and begin evacuating the World Trade Center. Some of that was like because they were being told by the Port Authority to stay put. But even in other cases, there's typically a delay period where you just sort of, don't want to believe what's happening. And I know I'm I'm totally susceptible to that as well, even though I talked about how I was hyper vigilant with the fireworks display. In other cases, like with the pandemic, it took me longer than I would have liked to have admitted to accept that this was real and this wasn't going away in 2 weeks, So you try to fit everything that happens to you into scripts and boxes for things that have happened to you before. And if you have no training or experience with something, you're going to try to you're going to delay, right? So one of the people I followed for the book is a woman named Elia Zdeno, who worked in the World Trade Center for many, many years. And when the first tower was hit, she knew something was up. I mean, it was not a subtle impact, but she found herself really not wanting to leave her cubicle. And she sort of walked around in circles for a while. She picked up a book that maybe she could read. Like you often see on plane crashes, people will automatically, so the plane's on fire on the ground, you need to evacuate. People will go for their overhead baggage. You sort of do things that you're used to doing because that's what's comfortable and that's what your brain is familiar with. Very hard to think in a disaster. So Elia finally did, she worked for the Port Authority as it happens, and she finally did leave and begin evacuating. And again, people went very slowly, and that's partly because people were so polite. Like, this is another surprise, is that people tend to be much more civil and polite and sociable than they are in everyday life. And that's,
I guess, because it's a bonding experience. They're all going through something together.
Yeah, there's a shared sense of camaraderie, but also you really do need each other in a way that you don't, at rush hour on the freeway. So there's a sort of evolutionary tendency to want to stick together in groups, which can be good if your group has some wisdom and insight about the situation. Can be bad if not. But Elia, what she told me was that she wanted nothing so much as to just stay in her cubicle. But luckily, someone recommended that she leave. People were evacuating. She started walking. Everybody was super polite. People were passing water bottles up to the firefighters, and everybody would move over if someone was injured so they could go down in front of them. And things were very quiet in the stairwells. So this is an example of how people actually behave in disasters, and that's very different, right, from what we might expect based on movies and often how people plan for disasters. So in real life, the 15,000 people who got out of the Trade Center that day took about a minute per floor to descend, according to the federal investigation. So now when I go to skyscrapers, I know, okay, if I'm on the 22nd floor, it's going to take me at least, 22 minutes to get out of this place.
Well, a couple questions about her story. So, she took some time to react, but the Port Authority itself was saying, everybody stay still, don't leave. Why were they saying that? I mean, I was actually at the World Trade Center that day, but I had just left. I had there was a Dean and DeLuca at the first floor. I had breakfast and I was leaving, and I was a few blocks away. And when I saw it happen, and I even was in denial, for some reason, my brain was telling me, oh, this plane was on remote control, so there was nobody in the plane, and it's too early for anybody to have been in the World Trade Center, even though it was like 8:45 a.m. So I could see how people could get into denial, but but it was clear that it was a huge, massive explosion. I had never seen anything like it. And why do you think people were in denial that this is at least deserves some reaction?
Yeah, no, I remember I lived in Manhattan at the time, and so I just saw it on TV at first, and you saw the first plane hit. And I had the same, I came up with a very convincing narrative that it was a small plane that had, crashed into the Trade Center. And it was only when the second one hit that you're like,
Yeah,
but even then, it sort of
up.
took a while to process. And that was the same thing was happening in the stairwell. I mean, I think it depends on your experience. Like if you've lived in a war zone, maybe you would have been faster, right? I don't know. It depends on the kind of war. It depends on your narrative about the war. But because thankfully for us, most Americans had not experienced planes crashing into towers on purpose in recent memory, then, it's totally normal to try to fit that into your pre-existing narratives, right? Because that's how we I mean, that's how we process everything that happens to us all day long. And it takes a while, and that's a big challenge for, often emergency plans are written because in a way they expect the public to panic. But what I found is that usually it's the opposite problem. Usually it's like what the airlines call negative panic, which is not reacting.
Well, and you also mentioned how in these disaster situations, it's actually better, slower is faster. So if everyone panics, then nobody gets out. There's too many people are jumping over each other and trying to squeeze through a small door. But do people instinctively know that, like that slower is faster in these situations? Like to be orderly is a better approach?
Maybe, right? Because you see that civility and people being like social and wanting to stay in groups. So there's some of that is a survival tactic, right? Because you don't want to be alone in these situations. Rarely do people like panic as in, antisocial, punching each other out kind of behavior. That's really hard to find. Like you really have to look hard to find examples of that in real life. But sometimes we in the media say people panicked, and what we mean is, they went and bought toilet paper when there was no shortage, and that's not kind of a loose use of the word. But on average, people tend to move slowly. Sometimes that is good, to your point, because you're trying to collect information, and sometimes it is too slow. So it's hard because it depends on the situation. But in general, my advice to people is assume you're going to be in denial and notice when that happens and push through it, because that can take a long time.
I like that. Assume you will be in denial. Like it's kind of, and you mentioned Kahneman and Tversky and their cognitive biases. And Kahneman's point is you can't avoid cognitive biases. But I always wonder if you're aware of cognitive biases, maybe you could move the needle a little bit.
Yeah, right. I know there's debate about this, like right now with like implicit bias. Like if you're aware of bias, it doesn't actually seem to change any behavior. I think it really depends on the kind of cognitive bias, right? Like if there's certain things you're aware of, and it's going to make a huge difference just because you're noticing it. And there's other things that are so wired that it's going to be harder. You have to sort of train for it and get familiar with it. So like people who study plane crashes or any disasters, they tend to do things to help their brain out just in case. And it sounds crazy, but these are not normal people. So like when they check into a hotel room, they always take the stairs down the first time they leave just to see where they end up. Because you often will end up in like, I remember I was in Soho once at a hotel and I did this and I ended up in the kitchen and somebody wanted to search my bag before I left because they thought I worked there, And so you do end up in some weird places. So anytime, people in the World Trade Center who knew where the stairwells were, which was like less than half of people, they're much more likely to evacuate more quickly, right? So having something for your brain to work with is really helpful. And people who study plane crashes always count the number of rows between themselves and the exit. So that they could find it in the dark, which is how it usually ends up because there's so much smoke.
So in a sense, information is power. Like if you're in any situation and you know the types of disasters that could happen, information is power. So if you're in a plane, you always think to yourself, well, a plane crash is a possibility because I'm in a plane and planes sometimes crash. But you might not think the person next to me is going to have a heart attack on this plane ride. Because that's probably that's actually probably less rare than a plane crash, but I never think the person next to me is going to have a heart attack. I do think every time there's turbulence, the plane's crashing.
Yeah.
So I would probably know less what to do if someone starts like squirming and grabbing their heart or whatever in a plane, even if it's probable that they're having a heart attack. Now, with the woman from the World Trade Center that you were just mentioning, I remember part of her story is she was on the ground floor and she was starting to move towards the exit, but she was slowing down even more. And another woman linked arms with her, a stranger linked arms with her and said, "We've got to get out now." And what's up with that woman who's kind of sort of a hero here? Like, was she looking for people to help? Why wasn't she rushing out and ignoring everyone else?
Right. Now, what happened there is Elia, she finally goes on this odyssey to get down the stairs, and the Trade Center was complicated because there was parts at which you had to cross over to a different stairwell, and, it's an ordeal. And she finally gets out, And there's something called the illusion of centrality where people think it's just happening to them. So when she emerged onto the mezzanine there and realized there's like, debris all over the place, bodies, everything's crazy. She realized that this wasn't just a small event that was affecting her and the people in her stairwell. And that is like an overwhelming realization for the brain to process in that moment. So actually what happened to her is she lost her vision. Like she just couldn't see anymore. And this is not all that unusual. Usually what you get is a narrowing of your vision, kind of like you're looking out a peephole. This happens to police officers, lots of people in life or death situations. And it's your brain trying to like limit how much information is coming at it, right?
Wow.
So for her, it was not great, right, to lose total vision in this situation. And that's when this woman came up to her and was like, come on, let's go. And she just kept talking to her. Elliot remembers, like, this woman wouldn't shut up, is what she said. She's just like talking. So it seemed like for her, it was comforting to kind of be someone who takes over. Many people who grow up with a lot of chaos, I never found this particular woman, but many people who grow up with a lot of chaos can be really good in a situation like this, right? Like the other day I was talking to a woman who's married to a Syrian refugee, and he's not great day to day about remembering to do things, but if there's if they had to like move overnight, he'd be amazing, So there are people who can really come alive in chaos because they have experience with it and they know how important it is. And so maybe, I don't know, but maybe that was some of what was going on there. But she really did save Elliot's life, most likely, because the tower collapsed soon after that.
Yeah, and basically, I guess once the tower started collapsing, everybody in the buildings died, pretty much. I mean, there were some survivors in the rubble, but not many.
Yeah, everybody in that building that collapsed. Yeah, so for a lot of people who died in the Trade Center, they were above where the planes hit. So there's really nothing they could do. So it's important. I should have said even earlier, like a lot of this, I don't want to suggest it's up to you. Like, a lot of people who survive in disasters I don't want to say it's luck, because you could have designed things to make it easier to evacuate, but it's not under their control. It's not up to the individual. It's a collective issue. So if you look at like an earthquake that happens in San Francisco tomorrow and there are no injuries, the same earthquake happens in any number of 20 different countries around the world, you could have hundreds of people dying, right? So that's about the building code and the quality of the design, right? So that's not an individual level choice, but it is a man-made disaster.
So this is another case where like information is power. If you know, this building is going to collapse very easily because of the building codes, you would be more likely to get out. What's a case where it's not the people with more information that survive, but other people have a sense of, like you mentioned, if they have past experiences, they're more likely to survive. But that's also information is power when you've been through past experiences. What are other things can people do if they are not used to disasters? Like, I've never been in a disaster. Even though I had just left the World Trade Center, I wasn't in the disaster area at the time. So I've never been in a disaster. What could I do if something disastrous is happening? If there's a hurricane or a tornado or floods or crashes or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, you want to know what your biggest risks are. And there are now some good sort of websites and maps that help you figure that out. So, where are you right now? New York?
Florida.
Florida, okay. So we know it's not, obviously, depending on the time of year, hurricane season would be one, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways, Florida is better at managing disasters because they've had so many, sort of like California, right? But then there's other things that you might, not worry about, right? Like wildfires, right? Depending on where you are. So are you near the coast?
Yeah, I'm on an island.
Okay. So depending on where you are, tsunami, flooding, those would be things that, and it's actually a small amount of situational awareness can go a long way, particularly if you're visiting. Often it's tourists who are first to evacuate when ordered to do so because they're nervous and they haven't experienced it before. But then once something happens, they can be slow because they don't know what they're doing, right? And where to go. And so that's like where you would want to know how to get out of a building more than one way, right? And be sort of aware of where you are. Our brains aren't really designed to think vertically, if you think about it. So when we go up in a tall building, we don't think about it as if, like, imagine if that building were laid flat horizontally on the ground and you walk 20 floors, right, sideways, and there are no doors, right? Your brain would be like, oh man, this is a long tunnel, right? Like, if I have to get out of here, it's going to take a while. But because it's vertical, you don't really think of it that way, you know? So some of it is just being aware of where you are, how to get out, whom to trust, who's around you matters a lot.
And who goes in denial? So you mentioned, a big thing is, like you say, a lot of the people in the plane crashes, had their seatbelts still on and they were burnt up. Clearly they were in denial all the way to the end. Who goes in denial in these situations?
Yeah, I think your identity matters. Like, just like in the book I just wrote on conflict, like who you are and how you think of yourself really matters. So men are more than twice as likely as women to die during a thunderstorm, for example. Now, some of that is because men are more likely to work outside in situations that are high risk. Men are also way more likely to die in flooding. And again, some of that is because of their jobs, but some of it is because of overestimating their ability to drive through standing water, which is how most people die in floods, right? So some of it is like sort of your identity as far as, maybe you think of yourself as a great driver, or maybe you think of yourself as not wanting to look weak, or maybe you think of yourself as a protector of your family. I don't know. But that identity you have matters. Now, conversely, in the World Trade Center, women were twice as likely to get injured while evacuating. And this, for the most ridiculous reason, is because they're wearing high heels, right? So they took the heels off in the stairwell, and then now they're stepping on glass and stuff like that. So it's really hard to separate out like nature, nurture as usual, but who you are going into the disaster, and this is particularly true for communities, like what was up with your community, its weaknesses, its dysfunctions, its strengths before the disaster is hugely important to determining what happens during and after the disaster.
It seems like this goes against a lot of stuff with evolutionary psychology. So if you're walking past a bush and you hear rustling in the bush, chances are your instinct is to run because your ancestors who survived, didn't take the risk that there was a lion there. They assumed there was a lion there instead of just wind rustling the bush, and they ran. But now it seems like we're not, as a society, as tuned to risk as we used to be.
Well, yeah, it's true. I mean, are we not as attuned to risk, or is we not attuned to the relevant risks, right? I mean, there's a kind of concept in risk, research that it's not about the odds of something happening, right? It's about the odds plus a bunch of other things, and including dread, which is actually a technical term in the research, and I think one of the best technical terms I've ever heard. And dread it's like all of humanity in a word. Like it represents our evolutionary fears and hopes and lessons and prejudices all in this sort of dark X factor. So I tried to, in my nerdy way, create a sort of equation for dread to help me think about it. So it's in the research, it's like 6 different factors create how much dread you're going to feel about a given threat. And it's going to vary depending on the person, but it's how uncontrollable the threat is. If it feels like you have no control, right? Like a plane crash, then that's higher dread. If it feels unfamiliar, if it feels but imaginable, like if you could imagine it in your mind's eye, that is scarier. If it feels like there's going to be a lot of suffering, right? That is more dread. So cancer in that case would create more dread than a heart attack, right? And the scale of the destruction, so the loss of 100 people's lives at once creates more dread than 100 individual deaths. And then also the unfairness of the threat. So if something feels particularly unfair, that's going to increase the dread level. So there's a lot of emotion that goes into every risk calculation, which is sort of summed up in that word dread.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable,
packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and or cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get 2 memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply. So as we're recording this, yesterday was tax day. Do you think the entire country feels dread on tax day? Because all those things apply to taxes.
Right. Uncontrollability.
It's you can't really predict. You might owe more than you think. There's a lot of suffering involved.
There's unfairness.
You could view it as unfair. So I wonder how that, I wonder if there's something that happens every April or May when taxes are due. If, the stock market usually goes down a little bit during those months, but not as much this month. But it's interesting. So, you mentioned cancer as something that provokes dread, but I think, yes, if you have a bump and you haven't gone to the doctor yet, you might feel a sense of dread because it's unknown still. But I feel like there's a difference between, let's call them static disasters and dynamic disasters. So 9/11 was a dynamic disaster. It's a sudden thing that happens and you have to react instantly. Whereas heart attacks, strokes, cancer, these are things that it's so easy to be in denial about for years. There's plenty of people who have tumor the size of a grapefruit or whatever for years before they go to a doctor. It's easy to be in denial over these more static or longer lasting disasters.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the human brain worries about many things before it worries about probability, right? So there's a lot going on there in our calculations. And I mean, I think that's one of the reasons the pandemic was so hard, because uncertainty is just very hard on the human brain, and having it go on that long is really hard. So on the one hand, it's slow and static, to your point, which is a little easier. There's more time to get your head around it and learn more about the threat in some cases. But then on the other hand, there's no time to recover from it. So what we know from the research is you can recover from almost anything, right? Depending on your support system and your health and other things. But when it's chronic like that, when it goes on for over a year, is very hard on humans. We have to have a time to recover and regroup and learn and reunite. And so that is very, very challenging. And I don't think most people, even, I'd written about pandemics before, but most people didn't expect something that would last this long.
Well, also, if you think about the first SARS and you think about swine flu and avian flu, there was all this news that, okay, swine flu is now labeled a pandemic and blah, blah, blah. But none of these things really affected us in the U.S. And so maybe we kind of assumed the same thing would happen here.
Sure, right. Whereas you saw in China and other countries that had dealt with big epidemics, they were much faster in sort of getting their heads around it, right?
Did you feel dread at all during the beginning of COVID or just denial?
What's funny is I actually reached out to, I was writing some op-eds for the Washington Post, because I had covered disasters for a long time, and I was just trying to be useful and again, I think I was in a little bit of denial about the extent of it because I just really didn't want to believe that it was happening. I'm not proud of this, right? But I knew it was serious, and I was writing about it, and I reached out to Dennis Milletti, who's somebody's in the Unthinkable book, who had been a great source for me, very, very funny, outspoken, patient, thoughtful expert on risk communication. And I'd interviewed him many times, right? But it had been a while since I called him. And I called him and I was asking him, and he was much more distraught than I had ever heard him be. And this was in March of 2020, right? So this was very early. And he said that he was scared. And I'd never heard him say this. This is a guy who had, studied and written about and talked about like every conceivable kind of disaster all over the world. So I remember that bothering me that he said that. And I remember thinking, I didn't say this, but thinking that maybe something was going on with him and he just was not, in a good place, separate from the pandemic. And I quoted him in the Post story, and he said some really smart things, and he basically was really frustrated with the federal level of risk communication. And, this was his life's work. So he knew that having inconsistent messaging like that early on can really cause a lot of suffering that doesn't need to happen. Some suffering needed to happen, but not all of it. And so he was quite distraught. I quoted him saying some other things, but not that piece about being scared. And I remember asking him, are you scared that you're going to get COVID and die? Because he was older, And he said, no, because I'm a human and I overestimate my ability to survive anything, but I'm scared for the country, is essentially what he said. And earlier this year, 2021, about a week before he was due to get his vaccine shot, Dennis Milletti died of COVID.
Wow.
So it's very sad. And I wrote another piece now finally quoting him saying that he was scared, and it was, he was older, he had some pre-existing conditions, but it was really tragic because he had to spend the last year of his life watching, a lot of bumbling that didn't need to be that way. It was going to be hard no matter what. But there are certain things that we could have done better, and some states did better than others, right? But at the national level, I think it was very painful for him.
So tell some stories of some other disasters. You have so many different disasters here.
Yeah. There's a couple that aren't in the book that came to me after. As you know, like sometimes it's after you publish a book that people start giving you great stories. And there's a lot of great stories.
I always write my best chapters after the book's already published.
Exactly. You spend all this time trying to get the stories, and then they start coming to you. So there's a lot of great stories in the book, but the one that maybe I'll share that's not in the book is from a young man who reached out to me named Christian, who had survived the tsunami in Southeast Asia. And he was on holiday at the time in Thailand. He was working in Singapore. He was an expat, and he was, sort of sad that he couldn't go home for Christmas. And so he, with some friends, decided to go to this beautiful remote island for a few days. And so they went, and, he reached out to me because there were things that he wished he had known. And part of that was his own guilt, because he felt like he could have done more. But let me just tell you the story. So he was that morning, getting ready. They were going to leave that day. And as he got up out of bed, the hotel room he was in, which was only on the second floor, sort of flimsy building, started shaking. And he knew, because he had been in earthquakes before, that was an earthquake. And he actually got up and went to the window to see if there was a tsunami coming, because he had read in a comic book as a little kid, and it really scared him that earthquakes were one of the very few warnings that a tsunami might be coming. And he didn't see a sort of wall of water approaching the way it had looked in the comic book or in movies. He didn't see anything. It was a beautiful, beautiful, pristine day. Everything looked normal in the ocean. So he went down to breakfast and really didn't think much about it again. And then a couple hours later, he was packing his things back in his room, and he again heard this big crash and felt the building shake. But his brain did what we all do in these situations and tried to normalize it. He told himself that people must have, dropped their suitcases when they were checking out. The lights also flickered and went off. And then when he went to wash his hands after he went to the bathroom, there was no water. And it wasn't until then that he started thinking, okay, this is not normal. And he opened the door of his hotel room, which was out on the sort of a balcony, and the water was like an inch below his door. So the water doesn't come in like a giant wall. It just raises in a surge, right? And so, he had just been going about his business, packing his bag, and this huge tsunami had come, and it was right below him. So he ended up, with other people as soon as the water receded, wandering around, trying to find high ground, trying to help whom they could help, and going home to Singapore like the next day. And he couldn't handle it because it was such a disconnect between his life and this experience. So he went back to Thailand, helped create a charity to help fishermen rebuild their boats. And, a lot of this was a sense of trying to atone for not having evacuated the beach or realizing that this earthquake was a sign of a tsunami. And of course, that's unfair, right, for him to blame himself, but that's understandable. And the thing is, what he did find was that, about a year later in Thailand, one night he was driving home on a pretty remote mountain road, and he saw a bunch of cars pulled over, and a big bus had gone over the side of this cliff. And it just happened. And everybody's just sort of staring at it. People are crying for help. A lot of people had died on the bus. And he did not delay. Like, he just went into action. He started yelling at people, telling them what to do, and everybody complied, because that's what people do. And they pulled people out of this, wreckage. He put as many people as he could into his truck, and he drove to the nearest hospital, which was some distance away. And he remembers looking in his rearview mirror and seeing a chain of lights of other cars following him with other victims. And it was like the one moment of peace that he had felt in a long time, because he knew that he had to have a bias for action. He knew that things could go horribly wrong in ways you didn't expect. And in this one case, he was able to do something, really huge. So he wanted to share that story to show that this denial thing is real. The more information you have, the better, and you want to try to push through it.
It's crazy how the brain constructs these narratives that, as you say, normalize things like, oh, it's no big deal, or this is just a small plane that hit, or, even when the second World Trade Center was hit, because I was on the other side, I didn't see the plane. I just saw the explosion, and my brain said, and everybody was saying, oh, we're under attack. And I was saying, no. It's just an explosion. It's a leftover explosion from the first plane now hit the second building. Like, it was a cascading set of explosions. There was no other plane. And so I kept believing that until the TV said the Pentagon got hit. And then I said, oh, okay, something bad's happening. But you have this one section near the end, in the appendix, about basically how to boost your survival odds. And, and a lot of it is about, the first one is about, cultivating resiliency, but it's about realizing you have agency in just about any situation. Like, encouraging yourself to think that you have more control than you might think you have.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the hard things right now is that people feel like they have no autonomy or agency, partly because of the pandemic. There's a lot we can't control, partly because of politics. You can be super frustrated and have no impact that you can see on the day-to-day basis. And so anytime you feel threatened without any sense of agency, it tends to lead to dysfunction, in my experience. And it's tricky because sometimes you really don't have much agency, and to claim otherwise is a little bit like delusional, right? But whenever possible, trying to figure out what you can control and have that kind of bias for action is super healthy, not just for surviving a 1 in a million odds disaster, but just for your mental health, period, right? Like, there's just a ton of research on that. So it's really tricky right now. Like, the more people are sort of conscious, become more and more conscious of social injustices and racism and sexism. And that's all good. That's super important, right? To know about this and understand our history and understand bias and prejudice. And I wish we spent more time talking about what you can do, because that sense of of helplessness is really destructive from a mental health point of view. And so I'm linking to very different things here. We're talking about plane crashes, terrorism, and now, social justice. But I think there's a relationship. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, no, I definitely think so. And particularly the fact that a lot of this social injustice issues came up in the month 3 or month 4 of the pandemic is probably worth noting, because I think people were feeling such a lack of agency that the fact that, now they were allowed outside to protest and to express their anger and frustration in many different ways. There were many different types of protesters during this, and still are. I think they're definitely linked.
Yeah. It's like that emotion has to go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes it goes in a productive direction, and sometimes it goes in a self-destructive direction. Like but it's something that I wish, I wish there were half as much time spent, covering how to reduce racism as there is about how pernicious racism is. Because you can't marinate in that sense of powerlessness too long. Like that book, The Coddling of the American Mind, that Jonathan Haidt co-authored, is really quite powerful on this. Came out years ago, but it basically was like, look, everything that we know from cognitive behavioral therapy that you're not supposed to do is what we're doing, like sort of feeling helpless, feeling aggrieved, feeling like there's nothing you can do, feeling like every feeling is legitimate, not questioning feelings. Like those kinds of things are really, really unhealthy for humans. So whether it's, in a life or death situation or in a sort of collective climate of frustration, we have to find ways to be constructive, not fabricate ways to be constructive, right? Just for the sake of it, but focus as much on that as we do on the problem.
And you also mentioned in this list of things we could do is reducing anxiety, and because anxious people probably won't. It's sort of obvious when you think about it that anxious people probably won't respond as well as calm people to a disaster. But it's hard to reduce anxiety. Like, how do you do it?
Yeah.
I mean, people say meditation, but I know a lot of people who meditate, and right after they're done meditating, they're just as anxious as ever.
Yeah. Like people I know who do yoga are some of the most neurotic people, right? Like,
Definitely the people who do yoga.
Like sometimes it's the people who need it the most who end up doing the thing. So it's hard to make conclusions from it. But, one of the things that we know is really helpful with anxiety in the moment, and I talk about this in The Unthinkable, and I actually also talk about it in High Conflict. It sort of weirdly comes up in every book I do. But there's only one way in the moment to bridge your involuntary reaction to your voluntary reactions. And that's through rhythmic, intentional breathing, which, the special forces call this combat breathing, which is hilarious. Have you noticed there's this pattern where anytime people in a super masculine profession need to do something that sounds kind of soft, they just add an adjective in front of it to make it seem okay. Like combat breathing is actually the same as yoga and Lamaze, but it's like if you add the word combat, it's okay. And I just heard Chris Voss talk about this. He's the former FBI hostage negotiator, and he talks about tactical empathy in sort of doing active listening, right? Because active listening sounds super soft and squishy, but tactical empathy, that's okay.
It sounds manly.
Yeah,
now.
Exactly. So whatever works for you. But combat breathing, typically how it's taught is you breathe in for 4 beats, hold for 4 beats, breathe out for 4 beats, hold for 4 beats, repeat. It's like a square. So you go up for 4, hold for 4, down for 4. And I do it all the time, So anytime you're under stress and you want to be able to think straight, it is the one thing that is proven to work. Ideally you want to have highly realistic training for any situation you're in before you're in it, but that's not realistic, right? For most people.
That combat breathing, that's actually a yoga technique. So there's something called pranayama, which is the yoga of breathing. and that's a pranayama technique. So it's been around for thousands of years. So somehow they knew that.
Yeah, it works. It's like the only way we can kind of get access to our higher cognitive functioning. And it's true in conflict, right? It's true in an argument. It's true, it's a little late, like it's a little downstream from where you'd like to intervene, but it's important to have lots of tactics, and that's a good one.
Have you used that breathing? Like, let's say you're in an argument or in a conflict situation, speaking of your last book, do you suddenly are you aware, okay, now I have to breathe this technique and I'll bridge these parts of my brain?
Yeah. And it's the kind of thing where you have to practice it a lot. And Chris Voss talks about this too, about small stakes practice. Like you have to do it all the time in normal situations. And then it's really hard to do for the first time when you're like really agitated, right? And the same is true in a disaster. Like it's hard to do that in the moment. So you want to do small stakes practice with it. So I might do it when I'm driving, like if I'm getting frustrated, I might do it then. I might do it when I'm trying to, argue with my kid, or kids are great for small stakes practice of most things.
So wait, it's 4 beats in, breathing in,
hold for 4, out
breathe
for
out
4,
for 4,
hold for 4. Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's different ways to do it, but that's one that I find to work well.
It's interesting thinking about this concept of dread again. Like I'm thinking now about my reaction to the pandemic. I was in probably total denial, maybe still am, about the odds of me getting sick, even though the odds are there. And I know a lot of people who have gotten sick. I haven't gotten sick yet. So knocking on wood or knocking on glass here. I have a glass desk. But I remember there was one night in January of 2020 where I just couldn't sleep because I was in a total state of dread, not because I thought the US would get COVID, but I saw how factories in China were closing down because of COVID. And I realized that every company in the US, their supply chain starts in China. So I thought this would shut down the US. And I was obsessed that there would be tanks in the streets everywhere, that it would just be the breakdown of society. And I even woke my wife up and I said, we got to order things in advance. Anything that we need for the next year, we've got to order it now. And I didn't think that we would be shut down in the US. I didn't think COVID would hit here, but I did think that there was going to be problems because of all these factories shut down. And that was my worst moment of dread.
Wow, in January, like early.
Yeah. But I wasn't worried about COVID.
Yeah.
I was worried about the
but
economic
you could
ramifications.
already see the chain of events that it could lead to. Like there are certain things that you knew well about this, and so those were the things that in your head.
Yeah, right. So information is power. But then on the illness itself, I was getting distressed that people were exaggerating the possible consequences. Yeah. Like I forget which newspaper it was, but it was a prominent newspaper that said there would be 140 million deaths from COVID because there was a 2% fatality rate and there's 7 billion people on the planet. So they just said 140 million people are going to die from this, which to me was an outrageous exaggeration because it doesn't follow the usual math of pandemic. So I would pay attention more to those things rather than worrying about COVID. So I had like reverse dread.
Yes,
I was more angry about the reporting, but I had dread about the economy because that is something I knew more about.
Right. And also wasn't being already covered to death, right, at that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I agree. I did reverse dread. I like that phrase. I mean, I felt like, extreme frustration with some of the overreaction and then some of the underreaction. And particularly in the news media, like some of the overreaction, fear-based, reporting of statistics without denominators, without any perspective, that drove me insane. And I can't tell what percentage of that was because I was just 100% right. And what percentage was because I didn't want to marinate in fear and suffering in perpetuity. Like I just couldn't stay in that place. So whenever I saw examples of it might be exaggerated or fear-mongering, it made me really angry because, just mentally, I found it very hard to just stay day after day in this kind of crouch of fear. And so anytime it was exaggerated, that really, really pissed me off. So yeah, there is, the thing that is just, you can't get around is anytime there's a lot of uncertainty in any kind of disaster, including a pandemic, you will on some days overreact and on other days underreact. And so will everyone else, including journalists. Now, there's good journalism and worse journalism. Like there are ways to be much better about dealing with that uncertainty. But that's the hard thing is like it's very hard to get it just right.
Do you find the job of a journalist has changed in the past 10 years, 20 years? And this goes along with Hate's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Do you find that journalists are no longer about let's accurately report the news because now the agenda has shifted a little to, hey, we got to make sure we don't go out of business and lose all our subscribers. So what headline will get more people buying and what? I mean, there's always been sensationalistic journalism, even more so than there is now. But it feels like now there's different agendas necessarily that the editors have.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is a change in the business model for sure, which is huge. I mean, becoming much more of an attention economy like social media platforms. But there's also a change in like the power situation. Like it used to be that we journalists were the gatekeepers. Like we had the microphones and you needed to go through us, right? And that's not true anymore. And sometimes journalists still act like we have the microphones when we don't. Like everybody has a microphone now. And so that's a huge change. And sometimes there's this belief that, if we can just line up the facts, people will believe us. And the fact is we lost the trust of the American people a long time ago, before Trump. Major mainstream rigorous journalism outlets lost a lot of trust, rightly or wrongly, both in many cases. And so it sort of doesn't matter how many facts you assemble, unfortunately.
There's a book that just came out by James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian called How to Have Difficult Conversations or How to Have Extreme Conversations. And I just got it the other day. And one of the first things they say is, nobody's going to pay attention to facts. Don't use facts in your argument because no one cares.
Right.
And no one knows if you're right or wrong. So it's pointless. And I didn't see what their solution was. I haven't read the book yet, but I just noticed that part. And when you made me think of it when you brought up facts, that it's interesting how quickly they pointed out that facts are totally useless in these situations.
Right, which is totally counter to, my whole profession was like, my whole career was based on the fact that facts were the currency, right? And so it's like, it's mind-blowing. And I don't think that journalists have fully adjusted. And it is hard to know. Then, what do you do then? It's funny. I was just reading this paper from the 80s on something called motivational interviewing. And the guy who, came up with the idea was working with alcoholics and addicts. And it's the same thing. He starts out, he's like, all the social science is super clear. Direct argumentation doesn't work and usually is counterproductive. So don't tell someone that they're an alcoholic and they need to stop drinking, right? So it was so funny to me because it was like, super clear and obvious to him, just like in that book you mentioned, that you would never use direct argumentation to persuade. And yet, what is it we see most of the time in political posts on social media and in the news is like direct argumentation. And then we're like amazed that it doesn't work.
So what does he suggest?
So there's this thing, motivational interviewing, which I'm learning about. It was from Adam Grant wrote about it in his latest book, and then it got me really curious. So I'm taking a class in it because it's so fascinating. But it's basically a way of asking questions to help people surface the ambivalence and uncertainty that they actually do feel in real life about something. Like maybe they're a problem drinker, maybe they're not, and helping them surface that, right? And then slowly kind of by different questions and different emphasis, helping them sort out what they want to do about it. So, the person who's most persuasive to all of us is ourselves, as Adam Grant says, right? So self-persuasion is by far the best way to convince people. But then it's like, well, how do you do that? And there are lots of different techniques, but ultimately just, bombarding people with facts, especially when they're already dug in, is just counterproductive.
And this all plays out on social media. Like 2020 was such a great example because, right in the beginning of January, we bombed this guy in Iraq. We killed that general. And then suddenly everybody on my social media feeds they were talking as if they were generals. Like they knew everything about the Middle East and how we should attack and what was going on in the Suez Canal and this and that. Like people who knew nothing. And then, of course, as soon as the pandemic happened, everybody was, an epidemiologist.
Right?
Yeah. and so and nobody was ever wrong. So, and it's interesting because you look at like other pandemics or serious diseases like polio. We never shut down the whole economy. Why didn't we feel as much dread then as we felt now? I guess because now we feel, hey, we just have to shut down until it's cured because we believe more a cure is possible. Whereas at polio, they didn't know if there was a cure or not.
Right. Like, well, we knew less, and also we were less interconnected, right? Like, we didn't have people traveling from, like, I mean, right now, I think it takes like 5 days for a virus to go from a remote island to like major cities. Like, it's just a different sort of geometric algorithm for how these things spread. But now I'm talking like an epidemiologist, which I am not. See how I did that?
I actually fully owned it. Like I said, I am a Twitter certified epidemiologist, and no one should question my credentials. So I'm gonna look. You have one interesting thing here for avoiding boosting your survival odds, which is lose weight. Which is you're just being blunt and honest. But like if you're climbing over everybody in a movie theater, better to be agile and nimble and train for such a situation.
Well, like with anything, again, the healthier you are before a disaster strikes, the better it's going to go for you, right? Most likely. And that's true for a neighborhood, a church, a community, a country. I remember this hit home with such painful clarity after Hurricane Katrina. Like, New Orleans was a dysfunctional, messed up, corrupt city in many, many ways before Katrina. And you could see how much harder it was afterward as a result. So anything, this is why, like, anytime like there's a period of calm in your life, that's a good time to get therapy. Go deal with the stuff, because eventually shit's going to hit the fan. And that's a hard, you can deal with it then too, and you should. But the healthier you can be as a family, as a person, physically, emotionally, the more resilient you're going to be, right? And the same with neighborhoods. Thank God, we're having a little alley party in my neighborhood on Saturday evening. It's just like BYOB. And I'll tell you, I am going, And even though there's going to be some tedious conversation and pleasantries with people I don't really know some of the time, it is an investment in your future sanity. Like, you need to have these relationships with your neighbors because, regular people are the ones who are there in disasters. It's not first responders, right? It's regular people who you work with and live with. Those are the people who are going to make all the difference as we keep seeing. And just for day-to-day conflict, it's good to have those experiences that are mostly positive, and we've had too few of them lately.
Yeah, and you mentioned that get to know your neighbors is an important technique to boosting your survival odds. And also, I think, and you have a chapter on risk, and I think people aren't really meant to understand probability and risk. I mean, probability is a relatively recent invention in mathematics. It's like maybe 300 years old, 400 years old, and so I think people just relied more on instincts rather than calculating, mathematical equations to determine if they should take action. And, and this is the connection between, let's say, the subconscious and the amygdala, which is your not subconscious. And it's kind of hard to do math equations in a disaster.
Yeah, and even outside of a disaster, it's really hard. You're right. We evolved to do many things, and make rational calculations on risk is hard. We could make it easier, though, right? Like, I kept reminding myself during the pandemic, like, what I really want is for my dad to be at the level of risk he's at driving the car day to day when it comes to getting COVID. Like, how do we get those roughly? Because there's going to be some risk, right? And so there are ways to help us get better at risk calculations. And I think that's something that government could probably do much better. Insurance companies do a lot of this, right? Like, they design software to do this and often do it pretty well, and it's human behavior.
They have to. That's their that's their whole business model.
Yeah. So it can be done. Those are humans, but it's like we gotta help ourselves get to a place where we build emotion into the equation as opposed to ignoring it.
Yeah. So any other stories that stick out to you that just as a last story of some disaster and someone who survived it and something unusual about them?
Yeah, let's see. I mean, I think one of the people you mentioned early on was Rick Rescorla. So could we go back to him? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Rick
Yeah.
Rescorla was the head of security at Morgan Stanley, which was like a city unto itself in the World Trade Center. It occupied a huge amount of real estate. And he was a Vietnam veteran and had a lot of military training. And he was frustrated because he felt like there were some obvious holes in the security and evacuation procedures of the World Trade Center. And he had actually warned the Port Authority about that before 9/11. I mean, he was just really frustrated. He felt like people weren't taking it seriously. And so he started realizing that he couldn't always rely on the higher authorities in charge, which is always the case. So he decided to really deputize all the employees of Morgan Stanley. And I like this story because, he didn't give up on trying to make changes. He actually, made a proposal that Morgan Stanley move to a low-rise in New Jersey, I believe it was. So he kept pushing to make big systemic change, which is super important. But in the meantime, before that was possible, he was also popularizing the behavior that you would need to survive. And he really trusted regular schmucks like you and me to perform under stress.
I am a Twitter certified building architect of large buildings, so
I'm a Twitter certified
speak
schmuck.
for yourself.
So, yeah, but he, that was really cool. Like, he trusted people, so he did things that didn't happen almost anywhere else. Still doesn't happen in skyscrapers. Like, he would have random surprise mandatory fire drills, which, you can imagine some of the high net worth traders at Morgan Stanley didn't love, right? To have to be interrupted and walk down some stairs. Like, he made people actually walk down a few flights of stairs so they could have muscle memory for what that feels like. But all of that also is giving people a sense of agency, right? Like, they know where the stairs are. They know how to get down them. They know not to delay. And so it was very cool. Like, he actually noticed that people were moving too slowly. And instead of just, again, bemoaning, humans, he started timing them with a stopwatch and telling them how fast they were going and urging them to go faster. And they did,
So he understood, though, that the risk that they're in a building, particularly a building with 100 stories, there's a risk of evacuation. So I guess you have to understand in each situation you're in what the risks are so you could practice for them or at least think about them.
Yeah. He understood, he could think vertically, and he understood the risk of terrorism and of disasters. And he was there for the 1993 bombing that Ramzi Youssef did of the Trade Center that, was much less of a big deal. But still, he noticed how slowly people moved in that evacuation and how there was smoke in the stairwells. It was just kind of a disaster. So that really motivated him. So he got that kind of warning and he took action. So one of my favorite things he did is he didn't grant exceptions. So when I worked for Time Magazine in Rockefeller Center around the same time, of 9/11, we were told to just muster by the stairwell in case of a fire drill, right? And that's what we did. We were told to wait for directions. But Rick didn't believe in that. And so he knew that people had to have a bias for action and that they could be trusted with basic information. So when guests visited Morgan Stanley for training, which happened all the time, Rick made sure they knew how to get out too. So even though the odds were super slim of there being an evacuation while they were there for a 2-day training, he understood that they would need the help more than anyone else because they were guests, they were unfamiliar, right? And in fact, on the morning of 9/11, there were, dozens of visitors there for training, and they knew where the stairwell was. And people, there was a Port Authority warning to stay put, and everybody ignored it and then just evacuated Morgan Stanley. So, it's an example of how trusting the public and training them appropriately and giving them the information they need is a much, much better plan than withholding information and assuming the public will panic.
So do you think disasters are personal? And what I mean by that is 9/11 was obviously this huge disaster, or a plane crash is this huge disaster. But let's say you're married to an abusive alcoholic. That's also a disaster. Yeah. That's every bit as real as, a flood or a fire, something bad can happen to you. And do you think the same principles kind of apply to think rationally? Like, people will be in denial. Oh, my wife or husband is not an alcoholic, is not abusive. People kind of go through these phases that you described.
Yeah.
And I wonder if they can be treated in the same way.
Yeah, I like that idea of personal. I think every disaster is personal, right? And if your kid gets in a car crash, that's a disaster,
Yeah.
If you get cancer, that can be a disaster, right? And the difference is the scale and the response of those around you and how much support you have. But each time your, resilience going into it is often more important even than the threat itself, right? Depending, not always. But one of the things that this is going to sound weird, but I was just thinking that one of the things I might actually miss about the pandemic is that sense that you don't have to pretend everything's fine. Some people are much more affected and some are much less, but there is this shared sense of like, let's not act like, oh, everything's great. Everybody's kind of being a little more real. Even you read these op-eds or you walk into people in the street and you see your neighbor, there's like a realness. Like, people aren't pretending that they're great all the time. And often when people are going through personal disasters, they're alone. They can't talk about it every time they run into their neighbor. Their neighbor won't want to hear it. So that is something. It's not worth it, obviously, but like it's something that is kind of unique, right? Like you can call up anyone in the world, and on some level, there's a connection.
Yeah. Which is also a little depressing.
It's terrible.
Yeah. So Amanda Ripley, this is such a great book, The Unthinkable: Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. I always love your stuff. Thanks again for coming on the podcast. And I'm going to start doing combat breathing right away as soon as I get off this podcast.
I always enjoy our conversations, James. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, Brad, you know how Nationwide is more than an insurance company?
Yeah, they're one of America's largest financial services companies.
We get that in a song like business, life, retirement.
Or Nationwide's there to protect.
I'm kind of the jingle guy.
Not sure I agree with that.
Well, I'm not sure I like your hat.
Well, it would never fit on you.
Products issued by Nationwide Life Insurance Company or Nationwide Life and Annuity Insurance Company. The general distributor for variable products is Nationwide Investment Services Corporation, member FINRA, Columbus, Ohio.